Hey there, my name is Drew Brashler, and I want to help you feel more confident in your production gear no matter where you're starting from. Today, we're going to be talking about my favorite tips for a better snare drum sound. So let's go ahead and dive in. I think we can all agree that the snare drum is one of the most important parts of the drum kit. It's what keeps the audience clapping, it's what keeps time for the band, and you really want just a great snare drum that cuts through the mix and kind of really feels good. Now, I have a couple tips that I'm wanting to dive in and show you. Specifically would be timing of the microphones, or the phase of the microphones, the polarity of the microphones, and how those mix with the overheads. Now, when I am mixing front of house, the overheads are what I use to give me a very good overall picture of the drum set. Now, I want to place these in a spot that is what I call phase coherent to the snare drum. Now, that means that they're the same distance from the snare drum. I want my snare drum right in the middle of the stereo spectrum, and I want to just have a great snare drum sound. And to do that, I place my overheads in a spot where they're the same distance from that snare drum. And I'll check it by using a microphone cable. So I'll go grab a microphone cable or an instrument cable or an extension cord, and I'll hold it right in the middle, and I'll measure out to the first overhead. And then what I'll do is I'll measure to the other overhead, and I'll place them in a spot so that both of them are equidistant, or the same distance from the center of that snare drum. And that will ensure that your snare drum sounds great in the overheads. Now, the other thing that I use the overheads for is just getting a really good picture of the whole drum kit. So in a future video, I'm going to show you specifically how I end up miking my drum kits with my overheads, but I'm not going to dive into that today. But what I want to talk to you about today is the distance between that snare drum, that overhead, and then that close mic that you have on that snare drum, or maybe that bottom snare drum microphone that you have on the snare drum. All three of those, or four of those microphones, are really important to keep in time or in phase with each other. And I'm going to show you why that is. Now, the first thing that I'm going to talk about is the polarity of the microphones. Now, polarity is which way the microphone goes. Does it go positive first, or does it go negative first? Now, if you end up placing a microphone on the bottom of your snare drum and a same microphone on the top of the snare drum, those will be out of polarity with each other. When you hit that snare drum, it will compress that head down, which will pull a negative portion of that microphone away, and then the bottom microphone will end up pushing in. So these two microphones are going to be working the same way, but opposite of each other, because one is pointing down, the other is pointing up. So you'll end up finding that these two microphones are out of polarity with each other. Now, chances are they're in phase, which means they're the same distance from that microphone, but the polarity is what's different. Now, I'm going to go ahead and play some tracks and actually show you what this means. So I have my top snare drum microphone going right here, and here is my bottom snare drum microphone. Okay, so we can check out the difference between these two. This is a condenser microphone on the bottom. It's placed a little bit away from the head, so it's not going to get as much body as the top will. And that top microphone is a dynamic microphone, so it's going to get a little bit more body. Now, depending on how steep of an angle you end up placing that microphone on that snare drum will get you more or less body. If you want more body, a steeper angle is going to get you that. If you want less body of the snare and a little bit more of the stick hitting the head, or what we call the attack, then you'll want to flatten that microphone out a little bit. And you can also use distance to vary the amount of low end that you have on that microphone as well. So let's go ahead and listen to this snare drum. And then I'm going to go ahead and bring in the snare bottom. Now, I'm going to show you here. Here's my configuration in preamp. So I have 0 delay, and I do not have a polarity invert. And on the snare bottom, I do not have a polarity invert, and I do not have any delay. So here we go. Okay, so what I want to show you here is that the low end of the snare drum is kind of just like going a little bit away when we turn up the snare bottom. It just, all of a sudden, this deeper snare drum that we have, and it's not that deep of a snare drum, I realize that, but the body of that snare starts to go away when we turn up the snare bottom. We can actually see that in Smart here, and I have that on the screen for you. So I'm going to bring up the snare bottom here, and kind of that low end just goes away. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the polarity on one of the microphones. And the microphone that I'm going to choose is the bottom snare drum microphone. And that is because my overheads are up above that snare drum. And so if I was to flip the polarity of the top microphone, then I'd want to do the same thing with the overheads. And additionally, you'd want to do the same thing with the additional toms that you have if you have any close mics on those. So because the bottom snare drum is pointing up, the bottom snare drum microphone is pointing up, I'm going to change the polarity on that. So I'm going to flip the polarity of the bottom snare drum microphone now. And on the X32, we have a button right here that has a little phase symbol on it. Now, it is a polarity reverse. It is flipping the wires, positive and negative, to the opposite direction. It does not change phase, it changes polarity of the microphone. It would be the same thing as taking your XLR and swapping the positive and negative pins backwards. It is a polarity reverse. I know that some of you are going to argue that it is a phase reverse, and that is 100% wrong. It changes the polarity of the microphone. It has nothing to do with time. Time is phase. Phase is time. Polarity is just wires. So let's actually flip the polarity of this microphone. So there we go. We have flipped the polarity of the microphone. So here's the top mic. And here's the bottom. Now I still have the snare bottom selected, and I'm going to go ahead and turn off the polarity reverse. And on. And you can really see it in Smart. You can see it in the 250 hertz range. If I have this off, you'll notice that there's a little bit of a dip there. So we can see that we have a more full snare drum sound by having one of those microphones flipped in polarity. Now, we can also flip the polarity of the top one instead of the bottom, and we can get a similar sound. So I'm going to go ahead and change the polarity to the top microphone. So we are actually getting the same result by flipping either of the microphones. You just need to flip the polarity of one of the microphones. And my suggestion is to flip the polarity of the bottom microphone. Now, I want to show you the overhead microphones. So these are the overhead mics on this drum set. Pretty decent sound. I have them pretty much flat right now. I have a little bit of low-end roll-off happening. If I start bringing in just the bottom microphone, it will end up sounding a little bit more thin. It's a little more papery. So what I want to show you is that this is not a polarity issue on this microphone. The thinness that we're getting between the snare top and the overheads when we add both of them in is not a polarity issue, and I'm going to prove that right now. So here is the snare top microphone with the polarity reversed, and I'm going to add this in with the overheads. So let's first listen to the snare drum. Now, that does sound pretty good. However, there's a little portion of the mids that disappears when we add the two of those together with the polarity reversed. Now, what I'm going to end up using instead of that is the delay inside of the X32. And we can get to that by pressing View in the Configuration and Preamp tab. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off the polarity reverse here. And we have our delay that's right here. And to turn on our delay, we can just press this rotary knob, and then we can actually add delay to a microphone depending on how far we want to delay that microphone in time. Now, if you imagine a drum set, you have the snare drum right here, and maybe the overheads are about right here, and that distance is maybe about 2 feet. You can measure it if you want to, and then use some time math if you wanted to do that. But let's go ahead and use our ears here, since we don't have that picture of that drum set right in front of us. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this snare top microphone, and here's my overhead, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to delay in time this microphone to be in time with this overhead. So this snare top microphone is closer to that snare drum than the overhead is, and it's about 2.5-ish feet. And so I'm going to just use my delay, and I'm going to dial that in until it sounds good. And then we can actually use that polarity reverse, and it can go very thin to full sounding by just clicking that button. So I'm going to pull up the tracks here, and we can start listening. So I have my overheads unmuted, and here's my snare top unmuted. I'm just going to start dialing this delay. Okay, so you notice that I went too far because now that's starting to sound thin again. Okay, that actually sounds pretty good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this polarity reverse, and it's going to make that sound very thin versus full. Now, if you have that sound when you hit the polarity reverse, then you've hit the right spot. It's correct in time. As far as our ears, you know, there's other ways that we could do this. If we brought it into Pro Tools, we could see where those match up in time. But just using our ears, this is what we're doing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the delay and turn it back on. We can see the difference. We can hear the difference between these two. Okay, so here's with the delay on. Okay, now I want to show you the difference between just the polarity reverse and the delay here. So I'm going to turn off the delay and turn on the polarity reverse. Now I'm going to flip them. Again. Okay, so the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add in that bottom snare drum microphone. Now, we did have the polarity reverse on the bottom snare drum microphone, and I'm also going to need to delay this microphone by around the same time as I did on the top, so 2.4 milliseconds. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on that 2.4 milliseconds of delay on the bottom snare drum microphone. We do have our polarity reverse on that. So I'm going to show you the difference between no delay on these microphones and delay. So here is no delay. And then here's delay. So using those tips by placing those overheads and making sure that those are equidistant from the snare drum, and using delay inside of the board, and using that polarity reverse on one of the microphones, or all of the top-down pointing microphones, we can get a better snare drum sound. Now, there's a whole bunch more that I could diving into deeper into the EQ, or diving in deeper on the compression or the gate, but I'm not going to do that in this video. Right now, I was just wanting to show you the main difference that we can make just by getting the timing and the polarity correct on these microphones. Now, I hope that you can use this for getting that better sound at your church or venue. If you do have any questions, feel free to post below, as I'm always reading through the comments to get the next video to you guys that's going to be helpful for you. So thank you so much for watching.